This is Anarchast.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Anarchast. I'm your host, Jeff Berwick, coming in live from Acapulco, Mexico. Today we have Wes Bertrand, who's in Salt Lake City, apparently studying up to be on the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, from what he tells me. How you doing, Wes?
Oh, I can hit the high notes. Doing well, Jeff. How are you doing?
Great. I'm doing good, thank you. For those that don't know, Wes does the Complete Liberty podcast, a very popular podcast. How long have you been doing that, Wes?
Oh, it's been since, I think, spring of 2008. So it was about a year after I published Complete Liberty, the book, which is available for free for anyone who wants to check it out. It's on the website, completeliberty.com. And I actually have an audiobook version of that, so if you're on the go, you can listen to it.
That's great. And you know exactly what I'm going to ask you. It's the first question we always ask everyone who's new on our show. It's how did you become an anarchist?
Well, let's see. It all begins with Ayn Rand, doesn't it? My uncle actually gave me a copy of Atlas Shrugged upon graduation from college. I got a major in business management and a minor in philosophy. And so I had been taking some like existential philosophy classes and Asian philosophy, trying to find the meaning of life, right, in academia, which is kind of a exercise in futility sometimes. Most schools don't actually delve into the objective philosophy stuff much. So I just had finished reading Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And, you know, he talks about the Übermensch, the Overman, the Superman, if you will. The will to power was kind of taken out of context there. But he was trying to portray what it's like to be a heroic being, in a sense, on planet Earth. And he's got some colorful ways of stating this, but it wasn't really clear and articulate like I found in Atlas Shrugged. So once I read Galt's speech, of course, everything kind of changed. It solidified my views on a whole number of things. And shortly after that, I was reading Nathaniel Brannan's Honoring the Self, kind of try to figure out how these characters are in reality, because a lot of people say that Rand's characters are unrealistic and they're idealistic, too idealistic. But Brannan put it all in context psychologically, so it made the characters make a lot of sense through Honoring the Self, which is about self-esteem psychology. And it wasn't shortly after that I was shoveling snow in Sun Valley, actually, with some friends. And the guy that had hired us was a market anarchist. And I was just asking him some questions about, so, Rand portrays this idea of, minarchism, of minimal government, as something that protects your rights, and respects individual rights to the max. But what happens if you want to actually provide a competing service, if you can offer better services at a better price or just even the same price? What happens? Well, they necessarily have to exclude you because they have a legalized monopoly. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound very just. It kind of violates individual rights, right? He's like, yes, that's true. And so from then on, I was like, I guess I'm a market anarchist, and I'll have to modify the framework of objectivism accordingly. So I actually wrote a book called The Psychology of Liberty that kind of is an A to Z portrayal of objectivism from a more consistent point of view in politics.
That's great. Yeah, I recently just spoke with I don't know what he is, the CEO, the leader, the Grand Poobah of the Ayn Rand Institute.
Yeah.
And he was interesting. Yes, Nathan Brooks, is it?
Yaron, Brook, yeah.
Oh, Yaron. Oh, I thought it was Nathan. Okay.
It starts with a Y, I think. Yaron.
That's right.
He's from Israel. He used to be an Israeli soldier, of all things.
Interesting.
I guess in Israel you have military conscription there, right?
Yes, that's correct. And yeah, he's very pro-military, which was interesting to me.
Yeah.
So I guess you split off from that Randite sort of side of things a while ago, and
yes.
So was there any other things that helped you learn? You mentioned a few things. You mentioned Ayn Rand and the others. Were there any other steps along the way that really opened your eyes to how market anarchism can really work and function?
Well, actually, when I was doing research for my book, it was like 2 years after I had read Atlas Shrugged, back when I was 25-ish. I spent a good deal of time, many months actually, in the library there at Idaho State University. And fortunately, they had lots of books on market anarchism. The Rothbard's books were there, the Tannehills, and then you go back to Spooner. Not necessarily that Spooner is an anarchist, but his rhetoric is pointed in that direction. And then Bakunin, Mikhail Bakunin, and a couple others. What was the other one that starts with a T? Can't recall.
You're gonna have to give me more of a hint.
Benjamin Tucker, was it? Individualist anarchist, I think, from the 1800s. Anyway, a lot of these guys, I think Wendy McElroy talks about the historical origins of individualist anarchism on her site. Yeah, that was really a treasure trove of information to delve into and explore basically all the different aspects of it. And I think the real influential one that solidified my sort of objectivist take on market anarchism was it was a compendium by Jarrett Wolstein, who was an objectivist, and he kind of left the inner circle, or maybe the outer fringes of that circle early on, and said that Rand is incorrect in this realm. Like, we shouldn't have government; it is a violation of individual rights. And yet he was coming at it from an objectivist point of view, and of course Rothbard had similar viewpoints as well. And then the Tannehills, of course, Market for what was it? Is it Market for Liberty? That's
the Market for Liberty.
Okay, yeah. And Rothbard's is For New Liberty. So yeah, those were really helpful books.
Yeah, that was the book that turned me into an anarcho-capitalist, was The Market for Liberty. Just reading that book, and they're just talking about what the world could be like if it was anarchist, and it just shows you the potential. And some of the things that just excited me so much were just saying things like, what if the courts were privatized? So every contract you do in business or personally, you would have to say, I resolve that if we have a dispute, we'll go to one of these arbiters and we can choose amongst many. And just the fact that there would be private competition and you could choose a court, and if the judges are really bad, they'll end up basically getting fired or no one will hire them anymore. And things like that, things that don't happen in the government so-called court system, which isn't even really a court system at this point. It's really just a way for the government to put people in cages in the U.S.
Absolutely.
It's just completely out of control. How many judges now have been caught taking bribes just to put as many kids into jails as possible because they get kickbacks from some of the privatized jails, and I'd be all for private jails as long as they don't actually work with a government court system. That's the worst thing is of course, whenever you tie private with government, it just turns into a horrible monstrosity of fascism, which we have in the U.S. today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these public-private partnerships are just really on that slippery slope to fascism. And anything that's privatized in this mixed economy is going to be coming from government funding or government regulations in some way. I mean, if nothing else, the tax structure and the fiat currency. So we really can't have a private market until government is dissolved. People reject the idea that we need some centralized authority to run our lives above and beyond the marketplace. And this is the big issue for objectivists. You mentioned some neocon or warmongering views by objectivists, and it's pretty popular in that regard. They talk about national self-interest. And Rand actually had this idea of national self-interest. How is that even possible? She railed against collectivism, but she somehow thought that we still need a nation state to somehow keep the I guess the masses in line with some sort of authority that's top down and is a final arbiter, if you will. And Yaron Brook actually debated for like 25 minutes on this financial show. I don't know if you listened to that. Debated Yaron Brook. Yaron Brook debated Doug Casey.
Yes, I did. I wrote about that. I don't know if you saw my article. I laid one on Mr. Brook quite heavy after that, but go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and I really liked when Casey said, you're making assertions without any demonstration or proof of them, about the fundamental nature of humans and how we need a final authority. And it seems the big disconnect is they think, and I've gotten into discussions with objectivists in Southern California about this, that they think that force and what government does is somehow separate from the marketplace. It ought to be removed, like Yaron Brook talks about removing force from the marketplace, as if you can actually do that. Which, does that mean that you can't defend yourself on a personal level? I think he actually sort of contradicted himself by saying, sure, there can be private police forces or private security and all that, but at the end of the day, he finds real comfort in having that ultimate authority to say this way and no way else, and we're going to punish you accordingly. So unfortunately, that is erroneous. That the things that government does are somehow outside the marketplace. Because what is the marketplace? It's just people interacting with each other in society. The society is a group of individuals. So how do they determine how to interact, and what sort of structures or institutions do they have? And unfortunately, this institution called government is essentially a perceived legitimate institution by which mass extortion and shakedowns can happen in plain sight, and everybody goes along with it because it's for the common good, right?
Yeah, it's quite amazing to me how, I really got into anarchism in the last 10 years. So I'm a little bit of a newbie, a little bit of a virgin to anarchism. And the thing that's really is that's sort of a new philosophy. It really, even before 100 years ago, was not talked about very much at all. And beyond a couple of hundred years ago, forget about it. It wasn't even a concept. Which is bizarre to me, because I would have thought that would have been the original concept, is freedom, and then I thought we'd go to statism. And they did have freedom, thousands or tens of thousands of years ago, but they didn't really even know the concepts of freedom at the time, or why it was good, or any of those sort of things. And they eventually got taken over by statism and all that. And it's only now, thousands of years later, that we're actually putting together the framework for how this would all work if we actually had freedom. It's really a bizarre sort of a way of coming around to this philosophy.
It kind of is. And Jim Davies, who has the Online Freedom Academy, which is a free course for people to re-educate themselves, he talks about re-educating oneself, because our natural state is to be free to make our own choices and use our own property and respect the property of others. But I guess, yeah, the concept of property is something that's problematic in most people's minds, because they think, if everything were privately owned, including the oceans and so forth, how could you leave your house? You'd have to pay people to be able to go from one place to the other, and if they didn't like you, they could just sequester you on your property. So we have all these fears of what other people do with their own property and how they engage in commerce, and I think a lot of that arises out of the sort of domination, punishment model culture that we live in, which actually starts from childhood. So when people are reared as children in an environment where they really can't make their own choices, or they're not trusted to make their own choices, they're just kids, and they're treated with various forms of punishment and even reward systems. I've spent a lot of time talking about the punishment rewards model as a really erroneous way to look at human beings, because it's essentially pop behaviorism, treating people as if they're not reasoning creatures. And but the person that's administering the punishment and the rewards perceives themselves as a reasoning creature, because they're crafting this way to get this other person to do things. But the research shows overwhelmingly, in addition to logic showing that it's illogical, that this is just a really harmful model for human beings. And it's used pervasively in parenting practices, in schooling, full on, basically. The grading and the punishments and all the threats, basically, and the coercion. And of course, statism is the ultimate, the par excellence of punishment, because if you don't do what they say, you find yourself in a court. If you don't go to court, they drag you there. And then they punish you. They administer a sentence and they throw you in a cage as a way to deal with your behavior that they don't like. I mean, if there's any really false way to deal with people, it's to put them in a state where they can't make their own choices anymore and can't live as a human being would live. I mean, we talked about initially the state of the prison system, and I was listening to Liberty Conspiracy with Gardner Goldsmith, and Brett was on there, and I think Dale was on there too, but they said that upwards of like 6 million people are in the so-called correction system in the United States, so-called United States, legal construct, right? Which is more than the people that existed in the Gulag in Russia. Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about this. So that really gives you an understanding of the scale of the punishment model and how it can be inflicted on just such a mass of people.
Yeah, as a new father, I've been learning this as I go about how to treat children when they're younger. And, it's so easy to fall into a trap of just, yelling at them and just saying no and being an authoritarian figure. But what I've slowly been figuring out is, thanks to people like Stefan Molyneux's podcasts and through a lot of reading about homeschooling and unschooling, all these sort of things, is that you need to reason with them. Like they're people. They're just tiny little people, and if all you teach them is when I say no, you can't do that, then they will grow up that way, and they will grow up almost expecting an authoritarian figure in their lives. And if you just constantly reason with them and say, hey, you shouldn't do that. Now, of course, if they're going to hurt themselves, you actually have to, do something pretty dramatic to stop them. But once that point is passed, you actually can reason with them and say, here's why you shouldn't do that. And, it's up to you if you want to do it again. But, I'm giving you some advice here. And then, like you just said, then they go on to these public school systems, which is where the real damage gets done. Lenin said, give me your child for 4 years, and the seed I plant will never rooted. And in the U.S., they have 12, and after that, another 4 or 8 if they want to go on into college. And they're just every day indoctrinating them into statism, following orders, following authorities, respecting your elders, all that kind of stuff. And it's actually no wonder that so many people end up after all that thinking that anarchy is impossible.
Yeah, schools of fish in the water of statism, right? Even the Pledge of Allegiance, that's just symbolic of the indoctrination process. And most kids don't even understand what they're pledging to or what allegiance is. And, this idea of citizen and state, right, as Mark Stevens has talked about on the No State Project, that these are just false legal constructs as well. The government has no duty of protection to you, even though they pretend to be your protectors and providers, because they have a monopolistic, coercive organization. They extort their money. So how can they protect you when they're actually stealing your money, and threatening you with fines and being thrown in a cage if you don't conform to their model? So, I mean, yeah, it's just a rampant indoctrination process that I think there are some indicators that it is changing. Obviously, people are fed up with the government schools, and a lot of people are talking more and more about unschooling. So that's a very key aspect as well, to allow kids to have the intrinsic motivation to learn things on their own, when they want to learn them, how they want to learn them. And so the adult's responsibility is just to provide a context by which they can do those things. So it's a completely different model from what we have today. I did my master's thesis on optimal learning, basically, and came to the conclusion through the research, and Alfie Kohn's work was instrumental in this. The book Punished by Rewards has a whole bunch of research on this, that the punishment rewards model is just not viable for humans, and it actually begets more of itself. So people and even parents trick themselves into thinking, well, because I punish my kid and they stop doing right then and there what I didn't want them to do, then that works. But they find that they have to keep on using it over and over again, right? And they're more and more frustrated. So once you take the will out of the child and say, you can't make your own decisions, you have to abide by what I say, respect my authority, then the person inside sort of gives up as being a self-responsible person. And it's all about battles of the will at that point, right? And there's all those little skirmishes, the autonomy wars, as Marshall Rosenberg talks about in Nonviolent Communication. But you might be interested, and your listeners might be interested, in a series I did on parenting called Unconditional Parenting. I read this book by Alfie Kohn, subtitled Moving from Punishment and, let's see, what is it? I can't remember the subtitle, but Moving to Love and Reason is the last part of it. And I basically read the book and added my analysis, my 2 cents, as I went along. And it's really useful to understand this new way of parenting, even though it's age-old, depending on what primitive tribes you look at, the attachment parenting and so forth. But just looking at little people as human beings rather than things that need to be controlled and sort of modified so that they cater to one's own needs, but at the expense of their needs. So it's looking for a win-win approach to parenting where everyone's needs get met.
Yeah, I've lived the last few years in Mexico, and before that I lived in Thailand, and both of those places are quite free market. For whatever reason, I'm not even sure why, they just haven't gone anywhere near as fascist and as statist as the U.S. Mm-hmm. And because of that, you see kids in school, and I see totally different things than what I saw where I'm from. I'm actually from Canada originally, which is very similar to the U.S. in many ways. And when I was in school, man, everyone was beating each other up. Kids were cutting themselves. There was depressed kids. There was, it hardly seemed like there was any sort of normal, happy kids around. Whereas when I'm in Mexico, I see that all the time, and I think a big part of it is that they haven't learned how to really indoctrinate them here yet. So they're living quite free still, and you know, if you live freely, you're quite happy. I see it in my own son. He's 7 years old. If I try to stop him from doing something, he's not happy, and you know, he wants to do what he wants to do, and I think that's great, and I think he should, except for there's things that can't be allowed because of certain reasons, or whatever reason that might be. But you know, in general, everyone just wants to strive to be free. When people are free, they're happy. And you look at the people in the U.S. now. You have 25% of females on antidepressants. Not that that's helping them become less depressed. It's actually lobotomizing them. But everyone's depressed, and it's because they're living in almost complete slavery. Like, if you think about it, as soon as you leave your house in the U.S., first thing you do as soon as you start driving is, where's the cops? You're always looking in the rearview mirror.
And you better buckle up, and you better put that cell phone away.
Yeah, that's right. It's just constant oppression. It's so funny that so many people. It's amazing how much they brainwash them in the U.S. that so many people still say they live in the land of the free. Yet every single thing they do is watched and regulated. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, they actually just passed an ordinance in Salt Lake City banning smoking e-cigarettes in public. I mean, how do you get secondhand smoke from e-cigs? I don't know. I guess they don't want to.
Secondhand vapor.
Yeah, they don't want to show the sinfulness of this process in public so that other people might get bad ideas about it, right? It's all for our own good, right?
Oh yes, that's the best. Is it's all for our own good.
Yeah.
Like, how do I sign off of this? I did not want anyone to do anything for me for my own good, please.
Exactly. The social contract, that's one of the things we're indoctrinated with. And it's just kind of like a foregone conclusion that we should abide by this document that people formulated hundreds of years ago called the Constitution. And if we just get back to this founding document, then everything's going to be okay in America. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people that are liberty lovers promote this meme that somehow if we get back to a smaller government, it's going to make life better for us. It may initially, but keep in mind that the very document that had that small government conceived ended up a few hundred years later with the largest government in the history of humankind. So obviously there's a flaw there, and the flaw is the extortion aspect. Be able to create fiat currency to control other people's property and to say, you know, the power to lay and collect taxes. Who grants them this power? Well, then you get into the voting thing, right? Democracy, might makes right, and head counts trump principles. And somehow that determines how we're supposed to live our lives.
So I guess you're not voting for Ron Paul then, or are you?
Well, I sympathize with the people that are really on board with his campaign, and I like the idea of having someone in the limelight, in the mainstream at least, to promote aspects, little glimmers of liberty for people, to shake up the status quo. I think I most relish the disintegration of the mainstream media, because just the amount of misinformation and disinformation that they churn out, I think, is primarily responsible for most Americans' apathy and misguided premises about a lot of things. So yeah, I think Ron Paul is contributing. The whole movement is kind of a manifestation of this disgust with the status quo. People are learning about the Federal Reserve and the whole nature of fiat currency. Not that, I guess Ron Paul, his solution is to allow, basically rescind legal tender laws. I don't even know if that's possible from, the El Presidente status, but if you allow competition in currency, you see the demise of the fiat currency very quickly. So those kinds of things are inspiring. But whenever he talks about getting back to the Constitution, and then, as I said in my recent podcast, when he says the purpose of government is to protect a liberty, wow, that's really a mental gymnastic there, because government, it's kind of what Yaron Brook is saying as well, that government, at one time he told me that it's a necessary good. I asked him, is it a necessary or unnecessary evil, government? Because he gave a presentation about the ills of government on a capitalist economy. And he said, it's a necessary good. So if we look at government as something that should protect our rights and provide for us, we're really getting our society in a lot of trouble, because this organization is not respectful of rights. Otherwise, it would say, we rely on voluntary payments, and we will not exclude any competitors in the marketplace that can offer a better service at a better price. So we shall see. We live in an interesting time, though, when this campaign thing kind of shakes out towards the end of the year. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I've been enjoying some of the debates. It's sort of like having these 3 or 4 just your typical, the same people we've seen for decades, and then this other guy who's just totally not like them, and they all look at him like he's from outer space.
Yeah.
And it's just funny to see. And all he's doing is saying basically the truth and basically talking about what actually those guys are supposed to do with the U.S. Constitution. But none of them have even read the U.S. Constitution. It's just bizarre how this state has got completely out of control at this point. We're running out of time, though. I'd love to have you on again, though. It's been really excellent talking to you, Wes.
Yeah,
and,
good times.
Please let our viewers know how they can get more information and see your podcast, Complete Liberty.
Sure. They can just go to CompleteLiberty.com, and it's kind of a social networking site I have set up. So feel free to sign up and join in the forum and be part of this process to inform others of a stateless society and transition from this statism that we have to a voluntary system, which is it's inevitable. Sometime in the future, I would say within this century, actually, we'll get to this stage because of the spread of the memes through the internet, the access to information. So that's where they can find me.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And that's all the time we have for today. So
thanks a
for
lot.
joining us, Wes Bertrand, Complete Liberty, and join us again next time. This has been Anarchast. Peace, love, and anarchy.